University, the voice of Reichman University.
כל האוניברסיטה אודיוורסיטי.
The Baal Shem Tov has these whole teachings about how do we not push away, and that when we push away, as he says, when we have these sort of psychic assaults and we push them away, then actually they only multiply. They grow stronger. They attack us more because we're just feeding that same energy of aversion, right? That same energy of resistance. And so with my practice, I can actually just come and see, oh, I'm scared, or I'm shaky, or I don't know what's going to happen right now. And I can see that clearly instead of pretending something else is happening. And then at the same time, because of the tools of the practice, I can find a sense of stability and safety in this moment, which is not dependent on external circumstances.
Welcome to Raw, a podcast where we confront the complexities of war from the inside out. I'm Anouk, a journalist, author, yoga teacher, and meditation practitioner. Raw, or war spelled backwards, symbolizes how many of us feel in the face of the Israel-Gaza conflict, exposed, vulnerable, and seeking understanding. Here, we don't just discuss the external battles, but dive deep into our internal struggles, examining how this violence has shaken our very core. Join me in conversations with philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual leaders as we explore how to navigate these painful times with wisdom and resilience, finding guidance for our own paths through this raw, unfiltered world. Today on the show, Rabbi and Meditator James Jacobsen-Maisels shares about his journey through Judaism and Eastern meditation traditions and how they have helped him and his community since October 7th. Rabbi James is the founder of Or Halev, an organization launched with the goal of giving people access to a deep meditation practice through a cross-denominational approach to Judaism. Originally from Pennsylvania with a doctorate in Jewish studies, James lives in a consciously diverse Jewish community in Moshav Hannaton with his wife and 3 children. Today, we'll talk about why James sends his children to a joined Arabic Hebrew school, why as an Orthodox Jew he sought refuge in meditation to heal his anxiety and depression, and we'll discuss tools to approach our inner battles with more wisdom and compassion. James, thank you so much for joining, for coming this morning. Actually not coming because you're in your house and I'm in the studio, but for being here and for showing me this beautiful room that you're in with carpets on the wall, and I can see bits of paintings and looks like a very pleasant space to be in.
Thank you for having me this morning. Really happy to be with you.
You live in this kibbutz in the north, which is like a pluralistic Jewish community. So you have different kind of Jewish affiliations all living together, and then everyone sends their kids to different schools. You just told me before we started the interview that you sent your kids to a joint Arabic Hebrew school. Tell me a little bit about that. Where do you feel that stands today with the war happening and people, Arab Israelis, some of them like being called Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis, feeling very torn and kind of on different sides of this, what feels like a eternally unbridgeable divide?
I'd say that our experience being part of those communities, both as part of the school and in other work, relationships we have, has been, to be honest, one of the most hopeful and powerful things in this incredibly terrible and tragic time that we've been going through. the school has been incredibly supportive. It's been very clear, a sense of sorrow and loss and tragedy, absolutely clear that everybody is absolutely horrified by what happened on October 7th, committed to bringing hostages home, and sharing all kinds of different kinds of fears, that we each have, as Jewish Israelis, understandably, all the fears that have come up for us, whether it's the October 7th, the missile attack from Iran, the anti-Semitism in the world, there's a whole host of things that we're feeling as threats. And the Palestinian or Arab Israelis sharing similar senses. They're also right there. The missiles land on them the same as they land on us. They don't distinguish between what your identity is as they're coming from the sky, and other fears of being kicked out, fears of certain political positions being taken that makes them feel like they have no place in this country. And so, it's been important for us to be part of that process, and that our children will be part of that process and can understand people of cross difference. It's one of what makes democracy possible.
I find that particularly in Israel, even though it's a small country and there is such wide representation of people, or maybe it's in all places in the world, but people really tend to kind of form groups, communities of very like-minded people. And so I find that it's actually very, very easy to spend almost, 95% of your life being with those people. And I have to say, I'm one of them. I live in Tel Aviv, Old North, like even within Tel Aviv, which is a bubble, complete bubble in and of itself. You have like these neighborhoods which mean something. And the Old North is perceived as having like families close to the park, relatively high socioeconomic level. I would say a majority of Ashkenazi descendant Jews. And there's something very easy about that. It's extremely easy when I send my kids to school, which is 2 minutes away from my house, that the people who send their kids to school have the same values and have the same customs and think the same about a lot of things, and in my case are, left-wing and secular, like you said, bridge the chasms, bridge the divides. How do I start feeling like I can understand other people if I don't spend time with them? And actually, I started hiking the Israel Trail once a month. It's like once a month over 3 years. And it's what I can do because I have young children and I can't now take 3 months to go hike the Israel Trail. So once a month I meet with this group. And the group is like primarily made up of settlers. I will call them settlers, people who live in the settlements, or other people will call it Yehuda v'Shomron or the West Bank. And I had some preconceived ideas based on everything that I'd heard for 38 years. And I think part of me wanted to be in that group because I find that the polarization, the kind of extremism of pushing people that don't think like us away and shaming them and pointing the finger at them, wherever, we see it everywhere in the world, where there's people now shaming, every single Israeli, and in many cases every single Jew, or if it's Israelis, saying all the Palestinians are like no one there is innocent and all of that. It kind of tends to push people into those positions where they become more extreme because they feel so attacked and so misunderstood. And so I really admire what you're doing, especially because I find that it's a very hard place to be in. It's much easier to stay with your own people and to feel good within that, right?
It's definitely easier to stay with your own people. It's easy. There's less friction. There's less challenge. There's less confusion. But as we can see here in Israel, and as you said, everywhere in the world, it's also a recipe for disaster. I mean, we're a society, as you said, which has become so tribal and so divided into different identity groups along so many different lines, that it can be very hard to reach across those lines and really create dialogue. That dialogue might create agreement. It might still have disagreement. It might have disagreement in some areas, but actually there are areas we can agree, even if we have fundamental and deep disagreements in certain areas, right? It doesn't, when we get trapped in a sort of identity bubble, what happens is there's me and there's the other person who's the enemy, and everything is in conflict, right? Everything's in conflict. But that may not be the case. Maybe this particular thing is in conflict. We don't have agreement about that, but we can have agreement about lots of other things. And I think it's one of the, great dangers in our society right now. It's why, my kids go to that school. It's why the community I live in. It's also the work I do, Or Halev. We're very committed. We're an organization that does Jewish meditation and spirituality. And one of the beautiful things about the work we do is that we have a really vast range of people who come and participate in our programs and retreats. That's from secular to ultra-Orthodox and everything in between. And they come and can really see that there's a shared yearning for waking up, for presence, for love, for connection, for healing, for a deep connection to the Jewish tradition. It's important all the time. It's an important part of, I think, every human life. And as Jews, certainly, and as Israelis, it's a constant, I think, part of our life, a sense of threat and uncertainty and traumas, both our own and intergenerational. And of course, since October 7th, all of those feelings have just been heightened, by 10 times. And so the ability to come together, to be together across differences, but also to heal and to see the kind of alignment of our hearts in a certain way. Right? There's a way in which we all want this sense of connection, of okayness, of a basic sense of safety, of a heart and system which is open and flexible and ready to be in dialogue. I have a memory of many years ago, I'm trying to remember what year exactly, maybe 2012 or something, quite early, 13 in our work. We ran a retreat, and I just had this particular memory of a ultra-Orthodox man and a secular woman who sat near each other on retreat. They just happened to be, it's a hall, you sit somewhere, they happen to be near each other. And then at the end of our retreats, we usually have a sharing circle where people can share quite briefly, 30 seconds, a minute, about something that they experienced on retreat that they want to share with the community. And both of these people shared very similar stories. They talked about how when they sat down, they had this strong feeling of, that's the enemy. It's like, this is me, that other person there looking like that is the enemy, is the bad guy. And having this strong sense at the end of retreat that there was a sense of, oh, this person like me has the same basic needs, has the same basic yearnings, that we can connect on this level, even if we still might disagree strongly on our spiritual path, the way we're going to practice Judaism, our politics. There might be many things we still have strong disagreements on, but there's also a way of seeing that sense of also deep human connection, right? That is part of us as well.
Yeah, I think that kind of fortunately and unfortunately, that is something that can almost only happen when people come together physically. I mean, not touching. These people weren't touching, but they were in the same space. From an evolutionary point of view, we are wired to connect, to look at each other in the eyes, to kind of in some cultures to embrace, to bow to each other, to shake hands, to smell each other, we're mammals. And the problem, the deep illness of this society is that so much of the communication is happening online, particularly in social media. And that's what I really see is that, for example, on social media, it's almost impossible for people who come in having preconceived ideas, prejudiced, you're like this, you're like that, you're a colonialist, white supremacist, genocidal Israeli settler, or you're a terrorist supporting woke left-wing progressive idiot. It will be impossible for those two people to come together on social media unless they have some extraordinary mediator to not be even more inflamed. And that's what I really worry about, is that how vast those spaces are. You know, you can have billions of people at the same time on social media and only maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 people in your meditation retreat. But that's what needs to happen, because I can meet, I think, almost anyone in the right setting and connect to them on some level. I'm not saying, you know, like in that there aren't exceptions and there aren't times when that's not possible. But I think that if you put me in front of almost any human being at some point, there will be a basic, you know, if we're coming on an equal footing, there's no one here who is like higher or more in control. We have the same basic human needs, like you said, you know, food, shelter, sleeping, connection, smiling, playing, spirituality of some sort or meaning, and that's it. I want to talk a little bit about your role, both as a rabbi and as a meditator. I'm in the world of meditation. I haven't met many meditating rabbis. Maybe there are more than I know. So I want to ask you a little bit, first of all, about that. Tell us a little bit about the background of how that came to be. And I would also really love to hear how both those spiritual paths, because they are both, you know, you can have secular meditation, but ultimately it's a entering something that is bigger than you. And I wonder how both of those have helped you to navigate the last 6 months since October 7th.
Yeah, so I'll sort of look a little bit about my history, sort of where I came from. I grew up in a pretty traditional Jewish household, you know, very connected to my Judaism. And was going to college, leading a flourishing Jewish life. And I started meditating, first of all, really just from suffering. You know, I was, for various reasons, had entered into depression and anxiety, was just experiencing a tremendous amount of suffering and actually couldn't sleep. I had also damaged my body in various ways. And so I was working with a physical therapist, and he recommended meditation. And I said, okay, I'll try that. And I went and bought cassette tapes, for those of us who are the age who still remember those. So I had these green cassette tapes by John Kabat-Zinn, you know, sort of secular mindfulness teacher, and started doing that every night. Started with 5 minutes, and pretty quickly it was just, you know, powerfully obvious that this was a different way of relating to my experience. I didn't even know it. I didn't know that I had been running away from my experience, but I had been. You know, I've been running away from my experience, not really willing to share and see what was actually happening there. And probably the fundamental transformation of beginning that practice was the practice of turning towards, of just really being with what was arising right now, of really opening to it, welcoming, meeting with love and care. And so pretty quickly that went from 5 minutes to at least 45 minutes a day, you know, and has only grown from there. And had some powerful transformative effects, you know, tremendously healing for me, really transformative in terms of my own, you know, experience of depression and anxiety. Some powerful moments as I've been practicing for a while of really seeing the anxiety as this huge, you know, like green monster coming to eat me, and saying, all right, come on in, you know, like, I don't need to fight you. You can just come on and eat me. Go for it. And then amazing in that moment, it of course like dissipates and disappears, right? When we're not feeding it with our own resistance, there's all of a sudden all this space there that we can work with. So at the same time, I was still, you know, deep in my Jewish practice and feeling it very helpful in many ways with the learning, the prayer, tefillah, etc. And as I continued to learn and study, I started to see aspects of Jewish learning that I had not been exposed to as a child, for certain, primarily the mystical tradition. So in Kabbalah and in Chassidut, that were deeply in line with my meditation practice. You know, that had the same understanding of the divinity of all, that helped to see this sense of unity and connection, that taught these practices of non-resistance. So the Baal Shem Tov has these whole teachings about how do we not push away, and that when we push away, as he says, when we have these sort of psychic assaults and we push them away, then actually they only multiply. They grow stronger. They attack us more because we're just feeding that same energy of aversion, right? That same energy of resistance. And rather, we need to welcome them in, just as I did with the anxiety, right? And transform it. And so that was very powerful for me to see these teachings in my tradition that felt deeply resonant. And it also gave me, again, even though I'd grown up in a traditional household and had a lot of love for my Judaism and was learning it, where there wasn't any negativity or opposition there, and there was still a sense that something was missing, or I wasn't quite getting the depth of the wisdom I wanted, or I was being fed, for at least for me, ideas of God that were like, does that really make sense? Is that really my experience of the world? And now I was being, introduced to ideas of spirituality and divinity and the omnipresence of divinity, which were deeply, deeply resonant. And that really led me into being deeply interested in Jewish spiritual practice, so not just mitzvot, but what were our traditions of meditation, of reflection, of movement, of song, of dance, a whole variety of practices. And that's really been where my academic work has been, a kind of spiritual archaeology, sort of really looking into our sources and texts and seeing what are the spiritual practices that have been there, sometimes living lineages, but sometimes because of complex reasons, but also to a great extent because of modernity and the Holocaust, not living lineages. So my, deepest teacher, I would say, is Rabbi Kalonimus Kalma Shapira, the Pizetzner Rebbe, who was a Hasidic Rebbe from outside of Warsaw, who was killed in the Holocaust, was in the Warsaw Ghetto, is famous for his work Eish Kodesh, which is a collection of sermons that were given in the ghetto during the war. Also a deep meditation practitioner, teaches meditation practices, teaches a Jewish mindfulness practice. That's who I wrote my dissertation on. I'm a deep student of his work, and of course, unfortunately, never met him. And so that has been very powerful for me. And so my work really has been taking those practices, combining it with my own meditation experience in the secular world, also in the Buddhist world, and being open to other spiritual traditions, and being interested and open to learning from them, and really reviving, there's a kind of revival of those spiritual practices and offering them to wider public so that people can really connect to and touch the depth of that tradition. For me, I'll say, since October 7th, my practice has been a refuge, a lifeline, the sense of depth of the threat and fear, I think, has been so intense. I think for mostly everybody in Israel, on a very physical, visceral level, of the attacks themselves, of the sense of abandonment of the world, the profound sense of anti-Semitism and lack of understanding of who we are and our position. All that is combined, I think, to really a deep sense of threat and uncertainty. And I think not just in Israel, in our work with people outside of Israel, we've really seen the same things. That sense of just a deep sense of instability. Who am I? And am I safe in this world? And can I trust my neighbors? And can I trust the town I live in? And can I trust the world? And what our practice allows us to do is a number of things. One of the things it allows us to do, which I think is so important, as I talked about at the beginning, is first of all, just to be what we're actually experiencing. So often our coping mechanisms, which I'm not criticizing because they make sense when we don't have other tools, is to run away from our experience, to pretend that something else is happening, to get lost in a fantasy, to be scrolling through my phone, to do lots of other things, which sometimes get us even more lost in those same, to be doom scrolling and all the things people are saying about Israel, right? Not so helpful. And so with my practice, I can actually just come and see, oh, I'm scared, or I'm shaky, or I don't know what's going to happen right now. And I can see that clearly instead of pretending something else is happening. And then at the same time, because of the tools of the practice, I can find a sense of stability and safety in this moment, which is not dependent on external circumstances. It's not about pretending something isn't the case. It's not like pretending, Hamas did not attack us on October 2nd and there aren't real threats out there. It's not about telling some story. It's about they're noticing right now, I'm here in this room, my feet are connected to the floor, and right now I'm safe. Right now I'm safe. And I can actually connect to that, feel that in a visceral way. I was with a friend of mine, and we were going to do a dance performance for some folks who had been, there's, as you know, thousands and thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes, living in all kinds of crazy circumstances here in Israel. And so we were going, I'm part of a little dance troupe, and we were doing a performance for them just to like try to bring them some joy. And just before we were about to go on, he was like talking to me about what he's experiencing. I was like, kind of looks like you're having a little panic attack. He was like, yeah, I kind of feel like that. I'm constantly having that since October 7th, It's like, this just seems to be, I was like, okay, do you want to try something out with me? Just like, let's just try something out. He was like, okay. So we just sat for a moment together and I just led him through some meditation. We did some practice. We did some grounding. We found some safety in the body. And he was like, oh, okay. It's not that this has disappeared. It's not like this is like some magic bullet, but I can see it now and I don't have to be lost in it. And there's some space and sense of okayness, a sense of okayness in me. And so that ability to not be lost in the dark places my mind wants to go, the ability to see something broader and wider, to see the beauty, that's also present. I mentioned to somebody recently who was interviewing me, I'm sure you remember the night of the missile attack from Iran, which was a very stressful and overwhelming night and not sure what we were going to do. And I went and got my youngest and she was already asleep. I put her in our bomb shelter, just in case we had to do something in the middle of the night. There's things that many, many people did. And then the next day I was with another one of my children and there was this beautiful sunset. And we stopped for a moment and noticed this gorgeous sunset. And that was also true, right? That was also true. We tend to, when we're under threat, again, understandably and sensibly, when we're actually under acute threat, when somebody's, literally trying to do something to us, we narrow down, which makes sense, right? We get into fight, flight, or freeze. It makes a lot of sense. But it doesn't make sense to continue to live from that place because it's a very narrow place. It's a place that not only is going to cause a lot of suffering for us, it makes me we're going to lost in that fight, flight, or freeze response. But it also means that our whole world is narrowed down. And our flexibility, our openness, our creativity is extremely limited. It's extremely limited, right? And I don't know what the solution is. Like, I'm not coming here pretending that I know how we're going to solve this and I know we're going to move forward. I do not know. I don't know. What I do know is that if we're going to create a healthy society, if we're going to solve this, if we're going to create peace and opportunities for us to all live with dignity, it is going to take creativity. It's going to take opening our mind up and thinking in new and different ways. And we're not going to be able to do that if we're constantly caught in the sense of fear and threat.
And it's not just meditation that teaches that. People can sometimes have like also preconceived ideas about meditation. But there are a lot of things which can bring people back to that, what you call the creative self, the more developed part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is that place that can be turned on if we feel safe enough. And in order to feel safe enough, we can either do meditation or we can go for a swim if that makes us feel good, or we can hug someone, or we can, walk barefoot or take our baby in our arms or go do volunteering. And I think that that's what I keep coming back to in this podcast, is that in order for us to relate to the terrible reality that we live in from a place of wisdom, we need to feel safe enough, and we need to have enough moments where we feel connected and safe.
That's exactly right. I'll say a few things about it. The first is that one of the first things we did after October 7th was create a WhatsApp group that had short daily meditations. Anybody can join it. So if your listeners are interested, this group is in Hebrew. The English listeners, there are also English resources on our website as well, and meditations you can join. But short, that just allowed people to feel safe for a moment, right? Just practices of, I'm grounded for a moment. I can notice something beautiful. I can notice something pleasant in my experience, right? When we're caught in this sense, as you said, in that loop, or in that, vortex of anxiety or fear, the whole system is only going to be focused on one thing, and that is, Where's the threat and what does the threat look like, right? And we're missing out on a huge part of our experience. That's also, I think, the power of the Jewish tradition, which is, it's heartbreaking to say this in some ways, but the reality is this is not that unusual. That's the heartbreaking reality of our history. This is not that unusual. The reality is that Jews have dealt with these kinds of circumstances over and over again in many different places, in many different ages. And the tools we've developed, the tool, for instance, of a blessing, of just stopping for a moment and noticing there is something beautiful here, which I feel grateful for. A beautiful sight, a beautiful scent, a beautiful piece of food, right? Just that small moment of stopping for a moment and redirecting my attention, right? My attention could be on the threat, the worry, the anxiety. We're good at that as well, right? But we can also take a moment, which our tradition says should happen at least 100 times a day, right? Where the Talmud asks us to say at least 100 blessings a day. I can take at least 100 times a day to actually stop and notice something else, right? Notice something else. Notice actually that I was born into this world, and what an amazing thing that it's actually set up to support me. There's like air, there's ground, there's food that goes from the ground. Our tradition says that Hashem looked at the world, God looked at the world and said, it's good. That's sort of the basic attitude of the tradition towards the world, despite the threat, despite the fear. And I think any of us can imagine, even those of us who say blessings, but may not say it with intention or actually with presence, take any human being and they take 100 moments in the midst of their day, 100 times, to stop and notice what is supportive and beautiful, what they could be grateful for, right? Just that. And already that's a transformative experience. And so part of the decision is, what am I going to allow my attention to rest on? Sylvia Boorstein, one of my teachers, a major meditation teacher, Jewish, she says, the mind is like tofu, it tastes like whatever you marinated it, right? And so like if I marinate the mind in fear, anxiety, threat, anger, that is the experience that's going to be produced, because that's where I'm resting my attention. That's where I'm that's the juice that's being soaked in. If I consciously, and this is not easy, it's part of the practice, but I'll say in my experience, in my life, putting aside even October 7th, just my own work with depression and anxiety, one of the most powerful healing aspects of the practice has been the practice of repeatedly, many times a day, placing my attention on what is beautiful and supportive, and recognizing that there is a gorgeous, extraordinary world out there, which is also built to support me, and how that has shifted that, habitual negativity bias into rather seeing in a different way the wonder and beauty of the world. Now, there's no question that October 7th has, and everything that's happened since then has profoundly challenged that. I'm not in the same place I was before that. I'm not in the same place at all. But that practice is a practice of coming back, and allowing my mind to rest there again and again. There are so many forces pulling my mind to these other places, and legitimate forces. Not like my mind should never be there. It's important for us to reflect on those things. It's important to reflect on things like, as citizens here, what went terribly wrong? What can we do to fix that, right? I mean, these are all extremely important questions we should not be ignoring in any way, shape, or form. And it's not where my mind has to get trapped. It's not where my heart has to get trapped. And so our practice is to train ourselves to broaden that perspective. See, there's actually much, much more breadth and variety and vastness to my experience than these moments of pull and push, and these moments of pull and push. And when I see that, the whole system can start to relax and see that there's a wider perspective here. I don't have to get lost in that very, very narrow, tunnel vision. I can see something more broader, and it's beautiful, and it's divine, and it's connected. And I can start to actually live and respond from out of that vastness and breadth and width, rather than from the tightness, which is not only, I think, one of the problems of our age is not only is it evolutionarily, that we're triggered, habituated in that way, but we now have lots of social systems and media, et cetera, which are trained to grasp onto that aspect of ourselves and to make it even more acute, even more triggered, even more activated. And so there's a lot of work we have to do to step back from those systems and give ourselves a vaster perspective.
You and I know that even for the most advanced meditators, it's extremely hard to do in this day and age. And that's just something that I want to say, because I don't want anybody listening to this saying, you know, I'm not good enough because I will never be able to do what James, you know, says or Nuke says, or these meditators probably, you know, are able to do. Because I think when us as individuals live in a society whose entire workings are built and created so that your attention is constantly swept away, whether it's news or social media or just the fast-paced modern lives, it's very, very, very hard to go against that. And so that's at least not what I'm saying is, you know, you should always be able to go against that. But doing something small, you know, doing something small, whether it is 5 minutes of meditation or writing down 3 things that you're grateful for, or taking a deep breath, or going for a swim, or giving someone you love a hug, those small things are in themselves, I think, like a huge revolutionary act when you live in this society. And so if that's what you start with, that's extraordinary and good enough.
You know, none of this is being said as this is what you should do. All of this is being said as here are some options that you might want to play with and try out. And we don't have to think about, you know, did I do it yesterday? Did I not do it yesterday? How about just what do I do right now in this moment? I could just stop right now and ask, as you said, I could hold hands with somebody. I could notice something beautiful. You know, I could put my phone away, right? As I notice the benefits of that, I might make some stronger resolutions or practices around that, you know, which can be difficult to be in countercultural, and people spend billions and billions of dollars to grab our attention. Very smart people, right? Spend a lot of money to grab our attention. So there's a lot of work to do in the opposite way, but it has to be done, or it has to be done. Our invitation, at least in the way we teach, is that that can be done on a foundation of compassion, that we can have a great deal of just care and intimacy and tenderness with the full range of our experience, which is going to include for all of us all kinds of things: fear and anger and shame and confusion, and not because we're bad or terrible, because we're normal human beings. You know, the Piaseczny Rebbe, one of his teachings on his meditation practice, actually recorded by a student of his who fled Poland across Russia, ended up in Kobe, Japan. Not many Jews ended up in Japan during the war, and sat down and wrote down a reminder to himself of his learnings from the Rebbe, you know, being so far from the community. And so he wrote down a description of the practice, of one of these practices, and he wrote down one of his teachings of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said that if we really just pay attention to our mind for one day, we'll see that there's almost no difference between ourselves and a crazy person. It's just that we don't act on all those thoughts. And I remember the first time I read that, I was like, oh, that is very comforting. That's very comforting. As anybody spent any time doing meditation or observing your mind, you'll notice that the mind is wild. The mind is wild. You know, we think all kinds of crazy stuff and all kinds of complicated emotions and experiences. And we don't have to beat ourselves up about it. We can just notice, oh, that's part of normal human experience. That happens. And I can have some compassion and care towards it. And when I have that compassion and care, so now I'll say the whole foundation, the beginning of my practice, working with anxiety directly, was really just the compassionate embrace of that anxiety. Really just saying, hey, you can be here and I can love you. It can be tremendous healing. And there's things we can do for a moment. That's again why we share these practices of 2 or 3 minutes, right? It doesn't have to be like sitting down and doing some long thing. That can be great as well. But it can be taking 2 minutes and redirecting your attention.
I want to thank you very much for redirecting my attention, in all honesty. And the last 2-3 days, I've definitely been completely swept up. Like I was not able to really take the time or have that space of just being with what is happening, just everything was very fast. And so for me also coming in and remembering the value of the teachings, in my case, I come from more of a kind of secular place. That's where I came to meditation. And in your case, you have these beautiful additional teachings from Jewish spirituality, which is beautiful. And just remembering that has been really valuable for me. So thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me here. Really a delight to share and practice. And I'll just mention, organization is Or Halev, Light of the Heart. You can look it up online at orhalev.net. Courses, retreats, a whole range of resources to just find some sense of sanity.
Thank you for listening. This has been Raw. To listen to more of our episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. I'm Anouk Glory. Goodbye.